She was supposed to be getting married. Instead, she was running for her life. The Montana winter didn't care about her plans. It descended like a hungry wolf, all teeth and ice, burying the world in a pristine, deadly white. The air was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. Every breath was a gamble. Through this frozen hell, Maggie Harlow ran. Her wedding dress, a cloud of white silk meant for a cathedral in Helena, was now a tattered shroud. It snagged on every frozen branch, every skeletal shrub clawing up from the snow. It was slowing her down. It was getting her killed. Her bare feet were numb, torn, and bleeding. Little pink blossoms on the snow, marking her trail. A trail for them to follow. The satin slippers, a bride's delicate fantasy, were miles back, swallowed by the storm. She clutched a small leather satchel to her chest like a shield. It was more precious than her own heart, more valuable than the air burning in her lungs. She couldn't stop. She couldn't falter. Because behind her, she could hear the baying of hounds. The sound was getting closer. She crashed through a stand of ponderosa pines, the branches whipping her face, tearing at the dark hair that had tumbled from its pins hours ago. 3 miles? 4? It felt like a lifetime since she'd escaped the hunting cabin. They dragged her there after she fled the church, a remote, ugly place where they planned to force the vows from her lips. Away from the world, away from any hope of rescue. She'd seen her chance when the so-called minister stepped outside for a smoke. She'd bolted. She hadn't looked back. Now, a brutal gust of wind slammed into her, nearly throwing her to the ground. She grabbed a tree trunk to steady herself, and her bare hand froze instantly to the bark. She ripped it away with a choked scream, leaving a patch of her own skin behind. The dogs were louder now, so much louder, and through the trees she saw it, the flickering dance of lantern light. A man's voice, sharp and angry, cut through the howl of the wind. "Spread out! She can't have gotten far." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. It was a different kind of cold than the wind. It was the cold of the grave. She forced her legs to move, each step a symphony of pain. The satchel bounced against her bruised ribs, a cruel reminder of the man she was running from. A reminder of Maxwell's fury when he discovered what she'd taken. Then through the swirling snow ahead, another light appeared. This one was different. It wasn't the frantic, searching flicker of the lanterns. It was a steady golden glow. A promise. A homestead? Shelter? Or was it just another trap? She had no choice. Her body was giving out. The cold was seeping into her mind, making her thoughts slow and clumsy. She veered toward the light, a single desperate prayer on her lips. Let it be anyone but Maxwell's men. The cabin materialized out of the blizzard like a ghost. Small, humble, with a barn standing beside it like a silent guardian. Smoke curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth so profound it made her weep. Her strength finally broke. Her knees buckled. She was less than 50 yards from the barn. She fell, but she didn't stop. She began to crawl. Dragging her ruined dress through the snow, her fingers numb and useless, she clawed her way toward the barn. The sounds of the hunt were still on the wind, but they seemed farther away now, tricked by the storm, following her old path. The barn door was a dark rectangle against the white, standing partly open. An invitation. With the last dregs of her will, Maggie pulled herself over the threshold and into the relative quiet. The sweet, earthy smell of hay and animals wrapped around her. She collapsed onto the dirt floor, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms. Horses shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts echoing in the sudden stillness. Maggie dragged herself behind a stack of hay bales, pulling the satchel tight against her chest. She lay there, shivering, listening. Time dissolved. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Then she heard it, the crunch of heavy boots on packed snow getting closer. A tall shadow fell across the open doorway. Ezra Mason knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into his barn. The horses were spooked. Their ears twitched, their eyes wide in the lantern light. They weren't just restless from the storm. They were afraid. He moved silently for a man his size, his hand brushing snow from the shoulders of his heavy coat. 20 years in the cavalry and 5 years ranching this unforgiving land had taught him to notice things. Small things. Things that were out of place. His eyes scanned the familiar shadows, the stalls, the tack hanging on the wall, the loft filled with hay. Everything seemed normal, almost. Behind the hay bales in the far corner, he saw a flash of white. It was too clean, too uniform to be snow that had blown in. It was the white of fine fabric. He set the lantern on a hook, his movements deliberate, cautious. His hand fell to the hilt of the long knife at his belt, an old habit from a life he'd tried to leave behind. He rounded the bales like a soldier entering enemy territory, and then he froze. The sight that met his eyes stopped his breath in his chest. A woman. She was crumpled on the dirt floor, a torn wedding dress spread around her like the broken wings of an angel. Her dark hair was a mess of tangles and pine needles, fanned out across a face that was pale, bruised, and beautiful. Her lips were blue with cold. Her bare feet were a horror of blood and frostbite. She was clutching a small leather bag to her chest, her fingers curled around it like frozen claws. As he watched, her eyes flew open. They were a deep, defiant brown, and though clouded with pain, they locked onto his with a terrifying intensity. Her teeth chattered, but her voice when she spoke was clear and sharp as broken ice. "If you plan to return me to them," she whispered, "please, just kill me first." The words hung in the air between them, stark and absolute. Ezra didn't move. He just stared, taking in the desperation, the fight in her eyes. Outside, carried on the wind, he heard it too, the faint, distant baying of hounds. The woman's eyes widened in sheer terror at the sound. And in that instant, Ezra Mason made a decision. He didn't say a word. He knelt, and with a single, fluid motion, he scooped her into his arms, satchel and all. She weighed almost nothing. Her body was as cold as a block of ice, trembling violently against his chest. "No!" she protested, her voice a weak thread of sound. She tried to push him away, a futile gesture. "Be still," he said. His voice was rough, gravelly from disuse. "You'll freeze to death." He carried her from the barn, his own broad shoulders shielding her from the driving snow. He crossed the yard in swift, long strides, his boots leaving no tracks on the wind-scoured ground. He kicked open the cabin door, carried her inside, and kicked it shut behind them, plunging them into the warm, fire-lit dark. He didn't stop until he reached the hearth, where embers still glowed from the evening fire. He laid her down gently on the bearskin rug. Her eyes had closed. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. Not good. Ezra worked fast. He was a man of action, not words. He threw kindling and logs onto the embers, coaxing them back to a roaring blaze. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows across the one-room cabin. He turned back to the woman. Hypothermia severe. Frostbite. Bruises on her face, her arms. These weren't from the cold. These were from a man's hands. Someone had hurt her long before the blizzard tried to finish the job. He moved around the cabin with military efficiency, gathering blankets, a kettle, clean cloths. The woman still clutched the satchel, even in unconsciousness. He had to gently pry her frozen fingers from the strap. He set it aside on the small table. Then he began the delicate, urgent task of removing the ruined dress. It was wet, frozen stiff in places. Under any other circumstances, this would have felt wrong. But this wasn't about decency. It was about survival. He worked quickly, cutting away the frozen silk and lace, replacing it with warm, dry wool blankets. He began to carefully tend to her frost-bitten feet, washing them with lukewarm water, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. As he worked, she began to murmur, lost in a fevered dream. "The ledger," she whispered, her head rolling from side to side. Don't let them take the ledger." Ezra glanced at the leather satchel on the table. Whatever was in that bag, she had been willing to die for it. Once he'd done all he could for her injuries, he propped her up and managed to get a few sips of strong coffee, laced with whiskey, between her blue lips. The color slowly began to return to her cheeks, though it made the ugly bruises stand out in stark contrast. The immediate crisis was over. She was warm. She was breathing steadily. She would likely live, which meant he now had a new crisis, the one sitting on his table, the leather satchel. He shouldn't open it. It was her business. But whoever was hunting her through a blizzard with hounds wasn't going to give up. He needed to know what kind of trouble she had brought to his doorstep. He needed to know who he was, now hiding from. The buckle was simple. He opened it. Inside there was a single leather-bound book, a ledger, just as she'd said. He opened it. The pages were filled with neat, feminine handwriting, columns of names, dates, amounts, descriptions of land, mining claims, water rights, and alongside them, copies of loan documents, deeds, and legal papers. Many of them bore the same signature, a signature Ezra knew all too well. Maxwell Hammond. Ezra stiffened. His body went rigid. His hand moved unconsciously to the long, jagged scar that ran from his temple down his right cheek. A permanent souvenir from a night of fire and ash. A night he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. The past he had run so far to escape had just walked in his door, wearing a ruined wedding dress. He slammed the ledger shut. This woman, running from Maxwell Hammond, had stumbled into the one place in all of Montana territory where the deck was already stacked. She hadn't found a random sanctuary. She had found an ally, or she had found a man whose own secrets were about to make her situation 1,000 times more dangerous. Ezra moved to the cabin's single window and peered out into the swirling white chaos. The storm was a living thing, a shrieking beast that would keep them safe for now. No one could track her in this. They had until morning, at least. A soft moan came from the hearth. The woman was stirring. Her eyelids fluttered. He knelt beside her again. "Water," she whispered, her voice cracked and raw. He held a cup to her lips, supporting her head. When she finished, she looked at him, her eyes struggling to focus. Where am I?" "My ranch," Ezra said. 30 miles from Fort Benton. You're safe for now. The storm covered your tracks." Relief washed over her face, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, assessing curiosity as she studied his scarred face in the firelight. Who are you?" "Ezra Mason. This is my land." At the sound of his name, her eyes widened. Just for a second, a flicker of recognition. She tried to hide it, but he saw it. She knew his name. She knew of him. "And you are?" he asked, his voice low and even. She hesitated, a war playing out behind her eyes. Trust or silence? Life or death? "Maggie," she said finally. "Maggie Harlow." Ezra gave a single, sharp nod. "Rest, Miss Harlow. The storm won't break before dawn. You're safe here tonight." He started to stand, but her hand shot out from under the blankets and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "My satchel," she said, panic sharpening her voice. "Where is it?" "On the table," Ezra said, nodding toward it. "It's safe." He didn't mention that he'd looked inside. Some truths could wait. Her eyes darted from the satchel to his face, searching for any hint of a lie. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. She released his wrist and sank back into the blankets, though her body was still wound tight as a spring. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not sending me back." Ezra just nodded again. He moved to the rough-hewn chair on the other side of the fire, added another log to the flames, and settled in for the night. He didn't plan on sleeping. Come morning, the storm would be gone, and Maxwell Hammond's men would start hunting again. He had brought this woman into his home, saved her from the cold. But as he stared into the fire, tracing the scar on his own face, he had to wonder, had he just saved her, or had he just damned them both? Sleep finally took her, a deep, exhausted sleep that was the body's last defense against trauma. Ezra stayed awake, listening to the wind scream outside the cabin walls. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm in the heart of the storm. Who was she? This Maggie Harlow. What did she have to do with Maxwell Hammond, the man who haunted Ezra's waking moments and starred in all his nightmares? And how in God's name did she know who he was? The questions churned in his mind, mixing with memories he fought to keep buried. The farmhouse swallowed by orange flames. The desperate, frantic ride back from town, knowing he was already too late. The smoke, the heat, the awful, gut-wrenching realization that he hadn't been there. He hadn't been there when his family needed him most. He touched the scar on his face, a permanent brand of his failure. 5 years. It felt like yesterday. The wound was still raw, still weeping. A log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Ezra blinked, dragging himself back to the present. Dawn was hours away. Maggie stirred in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Her brow furrowed. She clutched the blankets as if fighting off an invisible attacker. A nightmare, or just memories. Sometimes they were the same thing. He rose quietly and walked to the small shelf that held his few books. From behind a tin of coffee beans, he pulled out a small, tarnished silver frame. A photograph. A woman with kind, gentle eyes, and a solemn little boy of about 6. Rebecca and James. He rarely let himself look at it. The pain was too sharp, too immediate. But tonight was different. He studied their faces in the firelight, the ghosts of his past staring back at him. What would Rebecca think of the man he'd become? This solitary, bitter man, frozen in time by his own grief. With a sigh, he returned the photo to its hiding place. The past was a closed book. All he could do was survive the present. And the present had a name. Maggie Harlow. She had brought trouble to his door, yes. But as he sat back down, watching her sleep, a strange thought took root in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, she hadn't brought trouble. Maybe she had brought something else entirely. Maybe she had brought a chance for revenge. Maggie woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. This wasn't her room in Helena. It wasn't the cold, foul-smelling hunting cabin. Then it all came rushing back. The escape, the snow, the dogs, the barn, the tall, scarred man who had carried her out of the storm. She opened her eyes. Daylight streamed through the window. The storm had passed. She was on a bearskin rug, wrapped in thick wool blankets, in front of a crackling fire. Her body ached, a deep, profound ache in every muscle. But the bone-deep cold was gone. The man, Ezra Mason, stood with his back to her at a small stove. He was even taller than she'd remembered. Broad shoulders, lean waist. His dark hair was short, military style, with streaks of silver at the temples. As if he could feel her watching him, he turned. In the daylight, she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 40. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. And the scar, it was a brutal thing, a jagged line from his right temple to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his eye, giving him a permanent, assessing squint. His eyes, in contrast, were a startling, piercing blue. They watched her with the same careful scrutiny she was giving him. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. Maggie struggled to sit up, suddenly aware that she was wearing nothing but one of his shirts, which was enormous on her. The blanket slipped. "Your clothes were soaked through," he said, noticing her discomfort without a change in his expression. "They're drying by the fire. I mended the worst of the tears." She looked. Her ruined wedding dress and underthings were hanging from a chair near the hearth. The gashes in the fabric had been stitched together with thick, clumsy thread. It was functional, not beautiful, like the man himself. "Thank you," she said, her voice a dry rasp. He gave a single nod and turned back to the stove. "You should eat." While his back was turned, she scrambled to the small table. Her satchel. It was right where he'd said it would be. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, needing the reassurance of its weight, the confirmation that the ledger was still inside. "I didn't take anything," Ezra said, without turning around. "Though I did look inside." Maggie froze, her hand on the satchel. Of course he had. She would have done the same. "Maxwell Hammond," he continued, his voice flat, neutral. "You're running from him." Again, not a question, a statement of fact. Maggie clutched the satchel to her chest. This man had saved her life, but that didn't mean she could trust him. Anyone in this territory could be on Hammond's payroll, but he could have left her to die in the snow. He could have taken the ledger and turned her over to Hammond's men while she was unconscious. He hadn't. "Yes," she finally admitted. He turned 2 plates in his hands. He set one on the rug beside her, then took his own to the chair across the fire. Eggs, venison, and a thick slab of bread. The smell made her stomach twist with a hunger so sharp it was painful. "Eat," he said, starting on his own meal. "Then we'll talk." She hesitated only for a second. She ate slowly at first, then with a desperate urgency she couldn't control. They didn't speak until both plates were clean. You were supposed to marry him, Ezra stated, setting his plate aside. Maggie nodded. Her hand went to the fading bruise on her cheek. My father arranged it. I didn't have a choice. And the ledger? What's in it? She stiffened again. You said you only glanced at it. I'm a fast reader, he said, his blue eyes unblinking. It contains information Hammond would kill to keep quiet. She studied him, trying to read the unreadable face. Was he a threat? An ally? Or just a man caught in the middle? She had to take a chance. She was out of options. I was a legal secretary, she began, for a firm in Helena that handled all of Hammond's business. I found things, irregularities, loans with impossible terms, foreclosures on lands that should have been protected, bribes to judges, to territorial officials. She took a shaky breath. Maxwell Hammond has been stealing this territory piece by piece. He's been robbing farmers, homesteaders, and native tribes, using the law as his weapon. Ezra's expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in his eyes, something cold and hard. And he found out you knew, he surmised. Maggie's hand went back to her cheek. The memory was sharp, ugly. He found me copying documents. He would have... She couldn't say the words. The marriage was my father's idea, a way to buy Hammond's silence, a way to appease him. Your father gave you to the man who assaulted you, Ezra said. The words were flat, stripped of all emotion, which made them all the more damning. Maggie looked away toward the fire. My father's business was on the verge of collapse. Hammond offered him a lifeline. I was the price. A heavy silence settled in the small cabin. You recognized my name last night, Ezra said finally, changing the subject. Why? Maggie hesitated again, but she had come this far. She had to trust him. And if he was who she thought he was, he deserved to know the truth. You testified at the inquest, she said, watching his face carefully. The inquest into the deaths of the Callahan family. The fire, 5 years ago. The change in him was instantaneous and terrifying. His face became a mask of stone. The scar on his cheek stood out, white against his suddenly pale skin. That was a long time ago, Miss Harlow. I wasn't in the courtroom, she pushed on, but I've read the transcripts, all of them. I've been investigating other accidents, other homesteaders who refused to sell their land to Hammond, only to have a tragedy befall them shortly after. His jaw tightened. He looked like a man staring into his own grave. Why? He demanded, his voice a low growl. Why dig all that up? Maggie met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. Because they weren't tragedies, she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. They were murders, and they all lead back to Maxwell Hammond. The silence that followed was absolute. Ezra stared at her, his blue eyes turning to chips of ice. She had said the words he had never dared to think. She had given a name to the nightmare that had stalked him for 5 long years. Then he stood up abruptly, grabbing their empty plates. You should rest, he said, his voice rough, dismissive. He turned his back on her, ending the conversation. Maggie watched the rigid set of his shoulders. She had hit a nerve, a deep one. Exhaustion was pulling at her, but as she lay back down, her mind was racing. Ezra Mason knew something. He knew more about Maxwell Hammond than he was letting on. And that knowledge could either be her salvation, or it could be the one thing that got them both killed. He stood at the window, staring out at the blindingly white landscape. The sun was sharp, the snow a sea of glittering diamonds. Beautiful and lethal. Behind him, Maggie Harlow slept. She'd been in and out of a feverish sleep all day. The frostbite on her feet was angry, inflamed. Infection was a real possibility out here, miles from any doctor. But it wasn't her physical state that consumed him. It was her words. They were murders, and they all lead back to Maxwell Hammond. His hand went to his scar. The past wasn't just knocking at his door. It had kicked the damn thing down. A moan from the hearth pulled him from his thoughts. Maggie was tossing again, her face flushed with fever. He knelt beside her, placing the back of his hand on her forehead. She was burning up. He soaked a cloth in cool water and laid it gently on her brow. Her eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. The ledger, she mumbled, her hand reaching for something that wasn't there. Must hide it. He's coming. It's safe, Ezra said, his voice low and steady. Rest. But her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her gaze suddenly cleared, locking onto his with a feverish intensity. You know, she whispered, her voice urgent. You know what he did. To your family. Ezra went completely still. A cold dread, colder than any blizzard, washed over him. The fire, she went on, her words starting to slur again. It wasn't an accident. Your wife, your son, Hammond did it. He arranged it. Just like the Callahans, just like the others. He pulled his wrist from her grasp as if her touch had burned him. His heart was a wild drum against his ribs. You're delirious, he said, his voice harsh. You don't know what you're talking about. I investigated, she insisted, her eyes fluttering closed. For months. All the fires, all the accidents, all of them. Hammond. Her voice trailed off as she slipped back into unconsciousness. Ezra was left kneeling there, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. It couldn't be true. It was impossible. Rebecca and James, an accident. A lamp knocked over. He was in town for supplies. A fact that had been his personal torture for 5 years. If he'd been home, murder? Arranged by Maxwell Hammond? He staggered to his feet and went to the shelf where he kept the whiskey. He poured a heavy measure into a tin cup and downed it in one go. The liquid fire did nothing to warm the ice in his veins. It was a lie, a fever dream. And yet, weeks before the fire, Hammond had made him an offer for the farm. A generous offer. Too generous, Rebecca had said. When Ezra refused, Hammond had been polite, but there had been a look in his eyes. A cold, calculating look. And then the fire. The all-consuming blaze that had vaporized his life. He poured another drink, his hands shaking. He had never connected the two events. The thought was too monstrous, too insane. But now there was Maggie Harlow, and her ledger full of Hammond's crimes, and her fevered whispers, naming the demon that had lived in the dark corners of his mind for half a decade. He went back to the window, staring, but seeing nothing. If she was right, if Hammond was responsible for the fire that killed Rebecca and James, then the guilt he had carried for 5 years wasn't his. Not entirely. The blame lay somewhere else, with someone else. For 5 years he had been punishing himself for not being home. But what if the real failure wasn't that he was away? What if the real failure was that he had said no to Maxwell Hammond? What if he had signed his family's death warrant with a single word? Across the room, Maggie moaned again. He looked at her. This stranger who had brought his past crashing down around him. Was it just a coincidence she had ended up here? At his door? In all the vast, empty miles of Montana? Or was it something else? Fate, providence, justice. He didn't know what to call it, but he knew with a sudden, chilling clarity that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that reason was buried in the ashes of a burned-out farmhouse, waiting to be unearthed. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Maggie woke up feeling weak, but clear-headed. The cabin was empty, but the fire was burning steadily. Her simple clothes, the skirt and blouse she'd worn under the wedding dress, were clean, mended, and folded on a chair. She dressed slowly, her muscles screaming in protest. Her bandaged feet could barely take her weight. She hobbled to the window. The snow was beginning to melt in patches. In the distance, she saw Ezra chopping wood, each swing of the axe powerful and precise. Her eyes darted to the table where her satchel had been. It was gone. Panic, hot and sharp, flared through her. Had he taken it? Had Hammond's men come while she was sick? The cabin door opened, and Ezra stepped inside, his arms full of firewood. He stopped short when he saw her standing. You're up, he said. His face was a stone mask. Where is it? She demanded, her voice tight. My satchel, the ledger. He dropped the wood by the hearth. Hidden, he said. Somewhere safe. Give it back to me. It's the only thing keeping me alive. Is that all it is? His blue eyes bored into hers. Protection? Or is it for justice? The question caught her off guard. Both, she admitted. He stared at her for a long moment, then walked to a loose floorboard near his cot. He pried it up and pulled out her leather satchel. I kept it safe, he said, holding it out to her. You talked about it in your fever. She snatched it from him, her hands trembling as she checked inside. The ledger was there, untouched. In my fever, she said carefully, watching his face. Did I talk about anything else? A shadow crossed his face. You mentioned my family. The fire. Her heart sank. I'm sorry, I didn't mean... You claimed Hammond was responsible, he interrupted, his back to her now, as he fussed with the coffee pot. You said my wife and son were murdered. There was no point denying it. Yes, I believe they were. What proof do you have? He asked, turning to face her. His expression was dangerous. Maggie hesitated. Her proof was circumstantial, a pattern of behavior, witness accounts that were never officially recorded, nothing a court would accept. Nothing conclusive, she admitted, but the pattern is always the same. Hammond makes an offer. The landowner refuses. And then misfortune follows. And Hammond always ends up with the land. Ezra's jaw was a hard, tight line. Circumstantial. Yes, she said, but it's too consistent to be a coincidence. Your farm, it had something he wanted, didn't it? He didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, a silent battle raging behind his eyes. Water rights, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. Access to Turtle Creek. Maggie's blood ran cold. He needed that creek for a new mining operation he was planning upstream. It's all in the ledger. The survey plans, the investors, everything. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, and the picture they formed was horrifying. For a moment, Ezra looked like he was going to shatter. He looked like a man who had just been told the world was a lie. Then the grief in his eyes hardened into something else, something cold and sharp and deadly. Hammond will come for you, he said. His voice had changed. It was flat, emotionless. He will never stop looking for that ledger. I know, as soon as I'm able, I'm going to Fort Benton. There's a judge there. Judge Hollister. He isn't on Hammond's payroll. Hollister retired 3 months ago, Ezra cut in. Health reasons. The new judge was appointed by the governor. Who was, Maggie knew, firmly in Hammond's pocket. Hope withered inside her. Then I'll go to Helena, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. To Washington if I have to. Someone has to be beyond his reach. Maybe, Ezra said, but you won't survive the journey. Hammond has men everywhere. So what do you suggest, she challenged? That I just give up? Marry him? No. The word was like a gunshot in the small cabin. Ezra's face was transformed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by a raw, burning intensity. No, he repeated, his voice softer now, but no less firm. You need a plan, and you need allies. Allies? Maggie gave a bitter laugh. Who in this territory would dare stand up to Maxwell Hammond? Ezra walked to the window, staring out at the melting snow. Not everyone is afraid of him, he said. There are still a few of us who value justice more than our own skin. He turned back to face her, his blue eyes as cold and clear as a winter sky. There's someone you need to meet, someone who might be able to help us. The word hung in the air between them. Us. He had just joined her fight. Or more accurately, he had just realized he'd been in it all along. Who? Maggie asked. Her name is Sarah Blackfoot, Ezra said. She helped me after the fire, and she hates Maxwell Hammond even more than I do. A new wave of questions flooded Maggie's mind. Who was this woman, and what had Hammond done to her? But she didn't ask. She just nodded. For the first time since she'd fled the church, she felt a flicker of something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. When do we leave? Tomorrow, Ezra said, his gaze steady. At dawn. He turned to look out the window again, his shoulders set in a line of grim resolve. If what you say is true, Miss Harlow, if Hammond murdered my family, then your war is now my war, and Maxwell Hammond is about to find out what it means to hunt a man who has nothing left to lose. The nightmare always started with the smell of smoke. Ezra was running, his lungs screaming, the farmhouse a distant torch against the black night sky. He shouted their names, Rebecca, James, but the roar of the fire ate his words. He was closer now, close enough to feel the heat on his face, to hear the timber crack and groan like a dying animal. The front door was a wall of flame. He ran for the back, or for the kitchen door. Inside was hell. Smoke, thick and choking, blinding heat, disorientation. He stumbled up the stairs, calling their names again and again. The bedroom door was hot to the touch. He kicked it open. The bed was empty. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through him. They got out. They must have gotten out. A whimper. From James's room. He fought his way through the smoke. Just as he reached the doorway, a burning beam crashed down from the ceiling. Pain exploded across the side of his face. He staggered but pushed forward. James's bed was empty. The closet was empty. Where were they? Then he saw them, huddled in the corner. Rebecca, clutching James to her chest, both of them silent. Too silent. Too still. No. He fell to his knees beside them. Their skin was cold. Cold in the middle of an inferno. Their eyes were open, unseeing. They weren't burned. They hadn't choked on the smoke. Something else had taken them. Something had killed them before the fire was even set. He gathered them in his arms as the world burned down around him. Then a noise from the doorway. A figure silhouetted against the flames. A man, just watching. For 5 years in this same dream, the figure had been a faceless shadow. But tonight, for the first time, Ezra saw his face. Maxwell Hammond. Ezra woke with a gasp, bolting upright on his cot. Cold sweat soaked his shirt. His heart hammered against his ribs. The dream. It was always the same. But this time it was different. This time it had a face. Was it real? Or was Maggie's story just poisoning his memories? He looked across the cabin. Maggie was asleep on the bearskin rug, her hand resting protectively on the leather satchel. Even in sleep, she was a guardian. He got up and added wood to the fire. He couldn't go back to sleep. Not now. He went to the small shelf and pulled out the battered tin box. Inside were the few treasures he had left. Rebecca's simple gold wedding band, the small wooden horse James had carved, and a folded piece of paper, the deed to the farm. Beneath them was a letter. He rarely looked at it. A letter from Maxwell Hammond, dated 1 week before the fire. He unfolded it. He knew the words by heart. Mr. Mason, I was disappointed by your rejection of my generous offer. I am compelled to extend one final opportunity for you to reconsider. This offer will not remain open indefinitely. There are other means by which the water rights may be obtained. I suggest you discuss the matter with your wife. Women often possess a practical wisdom in these affairs. At the time, he dismissed it as the arrogant threat of a rich man who wasn't used to being told no. Rebecca had laughed it off. As if I would ever leave this land, she'd said. This is our home, Ezra. Our future. 3 days later, he'd ridden to town for supplies. That night, his home, his future, his Rebecca, and his James had all turned to ash. He refolded the letter and put it back in the box. The evidence had been right here, all along. He just hadn't been willing to see it. He had chosen to be haunted by guilt instead of by the truth. Because the truth was so much worse. A soft sound came from across the room. Maggie was stirring, caught in her own nightmare. No, she murmured. Please, no. He went to her side. Miss Harlow, he said quietly. Maggie, wake up. Her eyes flew open wide with fear. She stared at him, not recognizing him for a moment. It's all right, he said. You're safe. Just a dream. Recognition dawned, and she pulled herself into a sitting position, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Her hands were still shaking. I was already awake, he said, before she could apologize for waking him. He went to the stove to make coffee. Do you want to talk about it? He asked, his back to her. The nightmare? She was silent for a moment. It was just memories, she said finally. Things I'd rather forget. I have those too, he said. They sat in silence while the coffee brewed. The simple sound filled the small, tense space between them. I've been thinking, Ezra said, as he poured 2 cups, about what you said, about Hammond and the fires. He sat down across from her. I believe you're right. The admission felt like tearing something open inside him. What changed your mind? She asked. He hesitated. A letter, he said, from Hammond, sent just days before the fire. It contained a threat. I just didn't see it as one at the time. Her eyes widened. Do you still have it? He retrieved the tin box and handed her the folded paper. She read it, her expression growing darker with every line. This is it, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. This is his method, the generous offer, the veiled threat, the suggestion that someone else in the family might be more reasonable. I've seen letters just like this in his files, and they are always followed by an accident. He took the letter back. Then he isn't just a thief, Ezra said, the words tasting like poison. He's a murderer. Yes, she said simply. I know he is. The truth was out. It sat between them, a terrible, living thing. We have to be careful, Ezra said. Very careful. What's our next move? The Sarah Blackfoot you mentioned, Maggie said. Do you still think she can help? He nodded. She knows things. She has connections. And she understands Hammond. How? Ezra's face hardened. Her husband was Blackfeet. They had a small homestead north of here. Hammond wanted the land for a railroad spur. They refused to sell. He paused, and the parallel to his own story was sickeningly clear. What happened? Maggie asked gently. Officially, a cholera outbreak, Ezra said, his voice flat and dead. Her husband and both her children died. Sarah only survived because she was away visiting family. When she got back, Hammond had already filed a claim on her abandoned property. That's monstrous, Maggie whispered. Yes, Ezra said, and it made her his enemy for life. She's been watching him ever since, gathering information, waiting. And you think my ledger is the opportunity she's been waiting for? Maybe, Ezra said. Combined with what she already knows, it might be enough. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw not just grief, but a cold, burning purpose. It's time to find out. When do we leave for her settlement? After breakfast, Ezra decided. The snow has hardened. You're strong enough to ride. We can be there by midday. Good, Maggie said, her hand resting on the satchel. The sooner the better. Hammond won't stop searching for this. No, Ezra agreed, he won't. But as he looked at the determined set of Maggie's jaw, at the fire in her eyes, he knew something else too. Neither would they. The hunt was no longer one-sided. Maxwell Hammond thought he was the predator. He was about to find out he was the prey. Dawn broke, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. It was a beautiful lie, masking the deadly cold. Ezra was already outside, saddling the horses, a sturdy gelding for himself, and a smaller, sure-footed mountain pony for Maggie. Inside, Maggie dressed in the clothes he'd provided, a pair of his trousers, cinched tight at the waist, a flannel shirt, a heavy wool coat. The ruined wedding dress lay in the corner like a dead thing. She slung the satchel with its precious ledger across her body. It had become a part of her. She stepped outside. Ezra turned, his unreadable eyes taking in her transformation. It'll do, was all he said. He helped her onto the pony, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. The settlement is 5 miles northeast, he said, mounting his own horse. The snow will slow us down. Stay close. There are drifts out here that can swallow a horse whole. They set off, Ezra in the lead, picking a path through a world that had been erased by the storm. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the soft crunch of hooves on snow. The silence stretched, becoming its own kind of pressure. Tell me about Sarah Blackfoot, Maggie said, needing to break it. Ezra rode on for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. After the fire, he began, his voice low. I wasn't right. I shut myself off. I started drinking. He touched the scar on his cheek. One day I rode out, blind drunk, fell from my horse, cracked my head on a rock. I would have frozen to death right there. He paused. Sarah found me. She was gathering herbs on my land. She dragged me back to her cabin, patched me up, sobered me up. And then she told me about her own loss, her husband, her children. She told me I was giving Hammond exactly what he wanted. Another piece of land, free for the taking once I drank myself into the grave. So you stopped, Maggie said softly. Eventually, he admitted. Sarah has a way of making you see the truth, whether you want to or not. And you think she'll help us? If anyone can tell us what to do with that ledger, Ezra said with quiet certainty, it's Sarah. They rode on. The trail narrowed, forcing them into a single file through a dense forest of pine. Maggie found herself watching Ezra's back. The rigid set of his shoulders spoke of a man carrying a world of grief. But he wasn't broken. There was a strength in him, a quiet resolve that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, not entirely alone. They crested a small rise and the settlement appeared below them, a collection of log cabins and traditional hide lodges nestled in a sheltered valley. As they approached, a man stepped out from between two cabins, a rifle held casually in his arms. "Ezra Mason," he called out. "It's been a while." "Joseph," Ezra greeted him with a nod. "We need to see Sarah." Joseph's dark eyes shifted to Maggie, assessing her. "And who is this?" "A friend," Ezra said simply. "A friend with a shared interest in Mr. Hammond." A flicker of understanding crossed Joseph's face. He nodded. "Sarah's in her cabin. She has another visitor. Arrived yesterday." Ezra tensed. "Who?" "White man. City clothes. He's wounded." Joseph stepped aside. "She's been expecting you, Mason. Said you'd be along soon." Maggie looked at Ezra, bewildered. How could Sarah have known they were coming? Ezra didn't seem surprised. "Sarah knows things," he said quietly as they rode toward a cabin set slightly apart from the others. Before they could dismount, the cabin door swung open. A woman stood there. She was perhaps 50, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face a beautiful map of lines etched by wisdom and grief. "Ezra Mason," she said, her voice rich and melodic. "I was wondering when you would find your way back." Her sharp eyes shifted to Maggie. "And you've brought the woman with the book of secrets. Good." Maggie's hand flew to the satchel. How? How could this woman possibly know about the ledger? "Come inside," Sarah said. "Both of you. There is much to discuss, and someone here has been asking for you." The cabin was warm, fragrant with drying herbs. On a cot against the far wall, a man was lying, his face pale, his breathing shallow. "My other visitor," Sarah explained, "found him half frozen near the edge of our land. Gunshot wound to the shoulder." She looked directly at Maggie. "He says he's your brother." Maggie's world tilted on its axis. She stepped closer. The man on the cot turned his head, and his fever-bright eyes focused on her face. The breath left her body in a rush. "Thomas," she whispered, stunned. "Maggie," he rasped, relief flooding his pale face. "Thank God I found you." "You know this man?" Ezra asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "He's my brother," Maggie said, her mind reeling. "Thomas Harlow. But how? Why are you here? Who shot you?" "Hammond's men," Thomas managed, his voice weak. "They came to the house after you ran. Looking for you. Looking for the ledger." A spasm of pain crossed his face. "Father tried to stop them. There was a struggle. I got away, but they shot me." "And Father?" Maggie asked, her heart frozen with dread. "Is he—" "He's alive," Thomas said. "But they have him. They're holding him at Hammond's estate. They're waiting for you, Maggie. They want to trade your father's life for the ledger." The room spun. Maggie sank onto a nearby chair. Her father, the man who had sold her to Hammond, was now a prisoner himself. The bitter irony was a poison in her throat. "How did you find us?" Ezra demanded, his suspicion unabated. "Not you," Thomas clarified. "Maggie. I knew she'd head north. I was searching for her when Hammond's men caught up with me again. I lost them in the storm." Sarah, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "He speaks the truth, Ezra. No one followed him here. I would know." The authority in her voice was absolute. Ezra relaxed, but only slightly. "It changes nothing," Maggie said, a sudden, fierce resolve cutting through her shock. "I won't give Hammond the ledger. Not for my father. Not for anything. Too many people have suffered. Your family, Ezra. Sarah's family. It ends now." Thomas stared at Ezra. "Ezra?" he repeated. "Ezra Mason? The man who testified about the Callahan fire?" He looked from Ezra to Maggie, confusion warring with his pain. "Is that why you're together?" "Yes," Maggie said before Ezra could answer. "We have a common enemy." Thomas struggled to push himself up on one elbow. "Maggie, you have to be careful," he rasped. "It's not just about the ledger. There's something else. Something I found out just before they came for me. What? Maggie demanded. It's about why Hammond was so insistent on marrying you. Sarah stepped forward, holding a bowl of fragrant stew. Later, she said firmly. Food first. Talk after. The man needs his strength, and you need yours. The path ahead is longer and harder than you can possibly imagine. She was right. The news was a bombshell, but Thomas was fading fast. Maggie looked at Ezra, at Sarah, at her wounded brother. She had found allies, but she had also walked into a trap far more complex than she had ever feared. Hammond didn't just want the ledger, he wanted her, and she had absolutely no idea why. Sarah ladled steaming stew into bowls. Eat, she commanded. The simple command felt like an anchor in a raging sea. They ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken questions. Sarah tended to Thomas, her movements gentle and practiced. The infection is deep, she said, joining them at the small table. He needs time. Time is something we don't have, Ezra said. Hammond's men are looking for her. They'll find this place eventually. Sarah's dark eyes met his. They will not find us unless I wish them to, she said with a calm certainty that was both unnerving and deeply comforting. She turned her penetrating gaze on Maggie. Now, show me this book of secrets. Maggie hesitated for only a heartbeat, then handed over the satchel. Sarah opened the ledger, her face unreadable as she scanned the pages. Names, numbers, land, she murmured. She looked up. This would ruin him, if it reached the right person. That's the problem, Ezra said. Every official in this territory is either on his payroll or terrified of him. Not every official, Sarah said. She closed the ledger. There is one man Hammond does not control, a U.S. Marshal, Robert Sullivan. He answers only to Washington. He has been investigating Hammond, quietly. Ezra was skeptical. A marshal in Helena? Hammond owns Helena. Sullivan's brother was a rancher, Sarah explained. He refused to sell his land to Hammond. A year ago, he died in a hunting accident. Sullivan never believed it. How do you know all this? Maggie asked, amazed. A small, enigmatic smile touched Sarah's lips. People talk to a healer. They tell secrets. I listen. She handed the ledger back to Maggie. This is the proof Sullivan needs. So we go to Helena? Ezra asked. That's a suicide mission. Thomas spoke from the cot, his voice weak but urgent. Sullivan isn't in Helena. He's been following the railroad survey crews, investigating claims of intimidation. He's near Silver Creek, 40 miles south of here. All eyes turned to him. How do you know that? Ezra demanded. Because I've been helping him, Thomas admitted, secretly feeding him information. That's what I discovered. Sullivan has been building a case against Hammond for months. Maggie stared at her brother, astonished. You never told me. It was too dangerous, Thomas rasped. The less you knew, the safer you were. Or so I thought. Silver Creek, Sarah said, nodding as if this confirmed something she already knew. If you leave at dawn, you can be there in 2 days. We? Maggie questioned. You and Ezra, Sarah said. Thomas stays here to heal. I stay to care for him. You must take the ledger to Sullivan. Together. Ezra was silent, weighing the risks. Finally, he gave a single, decisive nod. Silver Creek. We leave at dawn. What about my father? Maggie asked, the worry a cold knot in her stomach. One battle at a time, Sarah advised gently. Get the ledger to Sullivan. With federal authority, you will be in a much stronger position to help your father. She was right. Maggie knew she was right. But the thought of her father in Hammond's hands was a torment. As Sarah began to gather supplies for their journey, Ezra leaned closer to Maggie. Do you trust him? He asked, his voice low, his eyes on her brother. Completely? Maggie looked at Thomas, now asleep, his face pale and drawn. Yes, she said without hesitation. He has always looked out for me. If he says he's working with Sullivan, I believe him. Ezra accepted her answer with a nod. Then we have a plan, he said. It's more than we had this morning. And more danger, Maggie added. We'll manage, Ezra said, and his quiet confidence was a comfort. Hammond may have more men, but I know this territory better, and I've traveled through hostile land before. He touched his scar. The war. It was always with him. As Maggie lay down on a pallet Sarah had prepared, she watched Ezra and Sarah conferring quietly. They moved with an easy familiarity, two veterans of a long, undeclared war against a common enemy. In just a few days, her world had been turned inside out. She had fled a wedding, nearly died in a blizzard, found an ally in a haunted stranger, and discovered her own brother was a secret crusader. And now she was about to ride 40 miles through hostile territory to meet a lawman who might be their last and only hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, Maggie felt a flicker of something more than fear. She felt the thrill of the fight. Maxwell Hammond had started a war. He had no idea how many enemies he had made, and he had no idea they were finally coming for him. Ezra stood under the vast, star-dusted sky. The cold air was a clean shock to his system, clearing his mind. Silver Creek. 40 miles. With Hammond's men everywhere. The cabin door opened. Sarah stepped out, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "They're sleeping," she said, her voice soft as falling snow. "You don't trust her brother," she observed. It wasn't a question. "I don't know him," Ezra replied, "and I don't like coincidences." "And yet you trust her." "She risked her life for that, Ledger," he said. "That counts for something." Sarah was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I see the way you look at her," she said finally. "She reminds you of Rebecca." Ezra stiffened. "They're nothing alike." "No," Sarah agreed. "Not in face, but in spirit, in the fire in her eyes. She awakens something in you that you thought was buried." He didn't answer. There was no point arguing with Sarah when she was like this. She saw things other people didn't. "It's been 5 years, Ezra," she said gently. "You've punished yourself for long enough. It was never your fault." "I wasn't there," he said, the old guilt of familiar poison on his tongue. "And if you had been, Hammond would have killed you too," she said bluntly. "Then who would be left to seek justice?" It was an old argument between them, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, with Maggie's ledger hidden in the cabin, justice felt possible. "What do you see, Sarah?" he asked, changing the subject. He respected her visions, even if he didn't understand them. She grew still, her eyes distant. "Death," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Blood on snow. A choice that will define you both." She turned to look at him, her eyes sharp and clear. "The path you are on leads to an ending, and a beginning. Which one it is depends on the choice you have yet to make." The cryptic words sent a chill down his spine. "That's not very helpful." A small smile touched her lips. "It is all I am permitted to see, but know this, Ezra Mason. You were right to help her, and you are right to continue this journey." That was as close to a blessing as he was going to get. "I've prepared supplies," she said, returning to practical matters. "Food, medicine, extra ammunition. Joseph will give you fresh horses. The trail to Silver Creek is hard." "Thank you, Sarah." "Rest now," she advised. "Tomorrow will demand everything you have." He nodded, though he knew sleep would not come. "Sarah," he said as she turned to leave, "if we don't return, I will know what must be done," she finished for him. He watched her go, then turned his gaze back to the stars. The constellations were old friends, steady and unchanging. Tomorrow he and Maggie would ride into the heart of Hammond's territory. They were walking into the lion's den, but this time they weren't just carrying a ledger full of secrets. They were carrying the ghosts of everyone Hammond had ever wronged. And those ghosts were crying out for blood. They left before the sun, riding east into the pale gray light of dawn. Swift Elk, one of Sarah's most trusted hunters, had shown them a trail that was invisible to most, a secret path through Blackfeet land where Hammond's men would not dare to follow. They rode in silence, the new snow muffling the sound of their horses' hooves. The world was clean, cold, and quiet. It felt like they were the only two people left alive. By midday, they stopped in a sheltered grove of pines. Ezra scanned their back trail with a brass spyglass. "Anything?" Maggie asked. "Nothing," he said. "But that doesn't mean they aren't out there." They ate dried meat and hard bread, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. "What did Sarah mean?" Maggie asked finally. About blood on snow? A choice? Ezra lowered the spyglass. Sarah has glimpses, visions. I've learned to take them seriously. And what did her warning mean to you? He hesitated. It means this isn't going to be easy. It means one of us might not make it back. The stark words hung in the cold air. Maggie shivered, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. They rode on. In the late afternoon, the sky began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling in fast. Storm's coming, Ezra said. We need to find shelter. There's an old trapper's cabin near Eagle Creek. We can make it there before it hits. They pushed their horses harder, the wind picking up, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of snow. They were less than a mile from the cabin when Ezra pulled his horse to a sudden halt, his whole body instantly on alert. What is it? Maggie whispered. Smoke, he said, his voice a low growl. He pointed. A thin gray ribbon was curling up from the cabin's chimney. Someone's there. Maggie's blood ran cold. Hammond's men? Maybe, Ezra said. Or maybe just a traveler like us. We approach on foot, through the trees. You stay with the horses. He disappeared into the forest, moving like a ghost. Maggie waited, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind, sounded like a threat. He reappeared just as silently as he'd left. His face was grim. 3 men, he reported. They look like railroad surveyors, but they're armed for war. So what do we do? The first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Ezra made a decision. We can't stay out in this. We go in. We play dumb. We're a married couple heading to Silver Creek to buy timber rights. You are Margaret. I'm just Mason. Let me do the talking. It was a risky plan, a terrible plan, but it was the only one they had. They rode into the clearing, making no attempt to hide. The cabin door opened. A burly, bearded man stood there, a rifle in his hand. Evening, he called out. Looks like you folks are just in time to miss the storm. His name was Patterson. He was, he said, the chief surveyor for the Northern Pacific Rail Extension. His 2 younger assistants were Davis and Mercer. They were all friendly, too friendly. They offered them stew. They made room by the fire. This whole rail line is Hammond's pet project, Patterson said, stirring the fire. Man's determined to own the whole territory. Ruthless is more like it, the younger one, Davis, muttered under his breath. Patterson shot him a warning look. Ezra kept his face neutral, but Maggie could feel the tension radiating from him. They were in a nest of vipers. Heard there was a U.S. Marshal in the area, Ezra said, his tone casual. A man named Sullivan, investigating land disputes. The 3 surveyors exchanged a look. A flicker of something, unease, warning, passed between them. Marshal Sullivan was here, Patterson said, his voice suddenly cooler. Got recalled to Helena 3 days ago. Maggie's heart sank. Recalled or removed? Is that so? Ezra said smoothly. Too bad. I was hoping he could mediate a land claim for me. Patterson seemed to accept the explanation, but Maggie saw Davis watching them. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. The storm hit with full fury, trapping them for the night. They were offered a single bunk. They had to keep up the charade. Maggie lay down, fully clothed, acutely aware of Ezra beside her in the narrow space. The ledger was a hard lump pressed against her ribs. Sleep if you can, Ezra whispered, his breath warm against her ear. We leave before they wake. I don't trust them. She closed her eyes, feigning sleep, her mind racing. Sullivan was gone. Their plan was in ruins, and they were trapped with 3 men who worked for Maxwell Hammond. Her dreams were of chases, of cold eyes watching from the shadows, and of a storm that never, ever ended. Ezra's hand on her shoulder woke her in the dead of night. The cabin was dark. The storm had passed. The surveyors were asleep. Time to go, he whispered. They moved like wraiths, saddling their horses in the attached lean-to. Where are we going? Maggie whispered as they led the horses out into the fresh snow. Helena? Neither, Ezra said. Patterson was lying. I'm sure of it. We're going to a trading post at Junction Creek. The owner, Mackenzie, hates Hammond. We can get real information there. They were a quarter-mile away when a shout echoed from the cabin. They'd been discovered. They spurred their horses, racing across the open moonlit snow. By mid-morning, Ezra spotted them. 3 riders coming up fast behind them. Patterson and his men, Ezra said grimly. They're not surveyors. They're hunters. They pushed their horses harder. Ahead, a dark line of trees promised cover. They were halfway across an open meadow when Ezra reined in again. Riders, he said, his voice tight. Ahead. Maggie saw them. 4 more men riding out from the east, from the direction of Junction Creek. We're trapped, she breathed. Not yet, Ezra said, his eyes scanning the terrain. He pointed. There, a ravine. It's our only chance. He wheeled his horse south, and Maggie followed, her heart in her throat. They plunged down the steep side of the ravine just as the first group of riders spotted them. A shot rang out. They raced along the frozen creek bed at the bottom of the ravine. The high walls hid them from view. But then they heard it. Horses ahead of them. The second group was cutting them off. They were boxed in. Up! Ezra shouted, pointing to a terrifyingly narrow game trail that zigzagged up the ravine wall. Go! He spurred his horse up the treacherous path. Maggie followed, not daring to look down. Shots echoed below them. Bullets whizzed past. They reached the top, gasping for breath. The forest was only a few hundred yards away. They galloped toward it. Ezra's horse suddenly screamed and stumbled. It had been hit. Go on! Ezra yelled, leaping from the saddle. Get the ledger to safety. I'll hold them off. I won't leave you, Maggie screamed back. Another shot kicked up snow right beside her. Go! He roared, slapping her horse's flank. She galloped into the trees, tears of fear and frustration freezing on her cheeks. She looked back. Ezra was on foot, leading his wounded horse. The riders were closing in. He was a dead man. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave him. She wheeled her horse around and rode back out of the forest straight toward him. The look on his face was a mixture of fury and disbelief. Damn it, woman! I told you to run! Get on! She yelled, extending her hand. Now! He grabbed her hand and swung up behind her just as another volley of shots peppered the snow around them. They plunged back into the forest, the overburdened horse groaning in protest, Ezra's wounded bay limping faithfully behind. They rode for an hour, deeper and deeper into the woods, the sounds of pursuit finally fading. There, Ezra said, his voice strained. He pointed to a small, dilapidated cabin in a clearing. An old line shack. We can rest there. The cabin was empty but stocked with basic supplies. Firewood, coffee, beans. Ezra built a fire while Maggie tended to their horses. The bay's wound was a deep graze, but it would live. How did you know this place was here? She asked as she heated coffee. I logged these woods a lifetime ago, he said, staring into the flames. Before Rebecca, before everything. They were safe for now, but their plans were in tatters. What now? She asked. Junction Creek is out. Silver Creek is out. Sullivan is gone. Ezra was silent for a long time. There's one other possibility, he said slowly. A man I served with in the war. Franklin Reynolds. He runs a trading post near the Missouri headwaters. He's the only man in this territory I trust completely. If anyone knows where Sullivan really is, it's Franklin. How far? 2 days' ride, if we can avoid Hammond's men. He looked at her, his blue eyes intense and serious. Nothing is going to happen to you, Maggie. We will deliver that ledger. Together, I promise. The simple conviction in his voice was more comforting than any fire. She believed him. Ezra took the first watch. Maggie collapsed onto the narrow cot. The ledger clutched to her chest and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke hours later to find him still awake, cleaning his rifle by lantern light. You need to rest, she insisted. He finally relented, but not before showing her how to use the rifle. Better to know and not need to, than to need to and not know how, he said. She took her watch, the heavy weapon unfamiliar in her hands. The silence of the forest pressed in. An hour before dawn she saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. Then another. They were surrounded. Ezra, she whispered, but he was already awake, instantly alert. 4 of them, he said, peering through a crack in the wall. Maybe 5. They're closing in. How did they find us? Doesn't matter now. What matters is getting out. His eyes darted around the cabin. The back door. Through the lean-to. We might be able to slip out before they know we're gone. They moved in the darkness, their hearts pounding. They saddled the horses in the pitch-black lean-to. As they led them out, a shout shattered the silence. There they are! Gunfire erupted. Ride! Ezra yelled, pushing Maggie onto her horse as he fired back with his revolver. They crashed through the forest, bullets thudding into the trees around them. They plunged into an icy stream, the freezing water soaking them to the bone, hoping to hide their trail. They rode for hours, cold, wet, and exhausted, pushing their horses to their limits. Then Ezra pulled up short. Riders, he whispered, ahead. They were trapped again, more of Hammond's men. This way, he said, leading them toward a rocky outcropping. They hid the horses and climbed to a vantage point. Ezra peered through his spyglass. He was silent for a long time. It's not Hammond's men, he said finally. Who is it? A Blackfeet hunting party, he said, and I recognize one of them. He's from Sarah's band. He looked at Maggie, her body racked with shivers from her frozen clothes. They might be our only chance. They rode out to meet the four hunters. The lead rider was a man named Swift Elk. At the mention of Hammond's name, his face hardened. Hammond is bad medicine, he spat. He looked at Maggie's shivering form. Woman is cold. Our camp is near. You come. We help. They were led to a hidden camp of hide lodges. An old woman, the matriarch, many blankets, took one look at Maggie and immediately took charge. She was stripped of her frozen clothes, wrapped in warm buffalo robes, and given hot medicinal tea. Swift Elk knows a shorter route to Reynolds' trading post, Ezra told her later, as they sat by the fire in the main lodge. Through their hunting grounds. It will cut a day off our journey, and Hammond's men won't follow us there. They stayed the night, a brief, blessed respite from the hunt. As they prepared to leave the next morning, many blankets took Maggie's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Remember, the old woman said, her eyes sharp and knowing. Blood on snow, a choice to make. Listen to your heart when the time comes. The cryptic words echoed Sarah's warning, sending a shiver of dread down Maggie's spine. With Swift Elk as their guide, they made good time. The trading post was only a half-day's ride away. Hope began to kindle in Maggie's chest. Then they heard it, a single rifle shot echoing from the east, from the direction of the trading post. Then another. Then a volley. Trouble, Swift Elk said, his face grim. They crept forward through the trees. The main building of the trading post was on fire. 5 men were using it for cover, firing at a smaller storehouse. Hammond's men, Swift Elk reported after scouting ahead. Reynolds, the trader, is trapped in the storehouse. He's wounded. I have to help him, Ezra said, his face set like granite. I help too, Swift Elk said simply. I'm coming with you, Maggie insisted. Ezra looked at her, a battle in his eyes. He finally relented. Stay behind us, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. They circled around, creeping up to the back of the storehouse. Ezra knocked a coded signal. The door opened. Inside, Franklin Reynolds, a tough-looking man in his 50s, was propped against a wall, his arm wrapped in a bloody bandage. Took you long enough, Mason, he growled. The plan was simple, desperate. Swift Elk would create a diversion from the east. Ezra would attack from the west. Maggie and the wounded Reynolds would provide covering fire from the storehouse. Just before they left, Reynolds confirmed their hopes. Marshal Sullivan wasn't in Helena. He had been there 3 days ago, on his way to his late brother's ranch. He was building his case. He just needed one final piece of evidence. The ledger. The battle exploded. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once. Hammond's men were caught in a deadly crossfire, confused and panicked. One went down, then another. They were winning. Then a single shot rang out from a new direction. From the woods behind Ezra, he cried out and fell to one knee. Maggie screamed his name. A figure stepped out of the trees, a man in an expensive city coat, holding a smoking revolver. His face was a mask of cold, triumphant fury. It was Maxwell Hammond. Come out, Miss Harlow, Hammond called, his voice dripping with venom. He pressed the barrel of his gun to the back of Ezra's head. Bring me my ledger, or your protector dies right here. Maggie's world stopped. Sarah's prophecy, Many blankets warning, blood on snow, a choice to make. This was it, the moment of truth. Reynolds grabbed her arm. Don't do it, girl. He'll kill you both anyway. She knew he was right, but she looked at Ezra, kneeling in the snow, his blood a stark red stain on the white. She couldn't let him die. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in her mind. She grabbed a worthless account book from Reynolds' shelves, stuffed it into the satchel, and hid the real ledger under a pile of blankets. I'm going out, she said. Create a distraction. Be ready. She stepped out into the clearing. Let him go, Hammond. Hammond smiled, a predator's smile. The ledger first, my dear. She walked toward him, her heart hammering. Ezra looked up at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with a message. He understood. He gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. She stopped a few feet away. She held out the satchel, and then she made her choice. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. She dropped the satchel in the snow. Hammond's face contorted with rage. Then watch him die. As his finger tightened on the trigger, Ezra threw himself sideways. A rifle cracked from the woods. A revolver roared from the storehouse window. Hammond staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face as bullets slammed into him. His own shot went wild. He collapsed into the snow. The fight was over. 2 weeks later, Maggie stood on the porch of Marshal Sullivan's ranch house. Hammond was in a federal jail in Helena, awaiting a trial he could not win. The ledger, combined with Sullivan's own evidence and the testimony of Ezra, Reynolds, and even Maggie's own repentant father, had built an ironclad case. Hammond's empire of corruption was crumbling to dust. The door opened behind her. Ezra stepped out. His shoulder was healing, but he would carry the scar, just like his others. It's over, he said quietly. Sullivan leaves for Washington tomorrow. It's finally over. What will you do now? She asked. He looked out at the vast, snow-covered land, the land he had come to as a broken man. My farm needs tending, he said. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw not the ghost of his past in his eyes, but the promise of a future. But a man can get lonely, working a farm all by himself, he said, his voice hesitant. I was thinking I might need a partner. Maggie looked at this scarred, quiet man who had walked through hell with her, the man who had shown her what true strength and courage looked like. She thought of the home he had lost. She thought of the new one he might build, and she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that her journey hadn't ended when she fled the church. It had just begun. A partner, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. Tell me more, Mr. Mason. Tell me everything. The story of Maggie Harlow and Ezra Mason became a quiet legend in Montana, a story of how two broken people, brought together by a blizzard and a brutal injustice, found the courage to fight back, and in doing so, found not just justice, but each other. They reminded everyone that even in the coldest, darkest winter, the smallest flame of hope, if tended carefully, can grow into a fire that changes the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice from the wild frontier. And let me know in the comments, what would you have risked to expose a man like Maxwell Hammond?